Hello and welcome back to the channel, and thank you for joining me in another of my interview series. As you know, we've been exploring sovereignty and what that means, freedom from the system. Today we're looking at a slightly different way of freedom from the system by perhaps using the system to get what we want, things that the system perhaps didn't know could happen. But I'm very pleased to bring on Gavin today from Sovereign Empowerment, who's going to tell us a little bit how he works his magic, let's put it like that. Gavin, welcome to the show. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming along. We've been exploring all of this for I've been exploring, and the audience has been growing with me, and it's been absolutely fantastic. And I had Sovereign Pete on yesterday, and he was explaining how he does things from, I suppose, outside of the system, outside of the legal system. And I know that having watched a couple of your videos, and a big thanks to Darren from Funky Prepper, who made me aware of you, watching an episode in which he was saying, basically you're saying here's a way if you don't have to pay the council tax, and you go through that method. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because, who wants to pay an unnecessary tax if you don't have to? Although you may want to contribute. I'm not saying people shouldn't contribute to the bins and things like that. You may not want to contribute to the big fat salary that someone in the council has. That might, disturb you. So tell us a little bit, first of all, just to get into things, what's your way of dealing with the sovereign empowerment, and how did you start to sort of wake up to there was another way?
Yeah, good question. I guess I'll just give a little bit of an intro into how I got into this stuff in the first place, I guess.
Yeah.
So, I've always been one of those individuals that kind of bucks authority. So I've always had that natural inclination to, when someone's telling me to do something, I'm always thinking, well, why are you telling me to do that, and why should I? That's always been a part of me. So back in 2008, obviously, we know we had the big crash. And that was kind of I didn't know it then, but I know it now. That was my first sort of wake-up call, because it burned me quite badly. And so I just thought, well, you know what? I'm not going to let that happen again. Let me find out about what this financial system's all about. And obviously that was going down that rabbit hole. You start to learn the truth that it's privately owned and all the things that we know. So I guess I was semi-awake coming up to 2020. When 2020 hit, obviously, like a lot of people, boom, I'm wide awake to a lot of the different things, all these different rabbit holes. And, with that, just as sort of, again, me being anti-authority, I just thought, right, that's it. I am not contributing to anything to do with this system. Naively, I just stopped everything, and obviously everyone jumped on top of me. And that was kind of like, right, well, I better do something about this. And so I started looking into the law, and that was my introduction to sovereignty and everything that your great guests have talked about. And so I think, like a lot of people, you go down those rabbit holes, and this is just my particular experience with doing that. I comprehend it well, and I am sovereign, and I live my life that way. But what I kind of realised was that you can't use that with the system. It doesn't recognise it.
Right.
And the simple fact for me is that it's all well and good and great, and it's all true and everything else, but the system exists. The system is corrupt, and if you ignore it, it will run you over.
Because it's huge. It's like it's a massive juggernaut that it's difficult to fight when you're just a little man.
Exactly. And so I kind of started thinking, well, and I got pretty beaten up in the early days of doing this stuff, and that was, you've got to experience that to start thinking, right, what do I do? How do I do this? And I just started looking at the system itself. Well, how does this system actually work? And for me personally, I started with council tax, and I didn't know what I was doing. And in the earlier days, I was just throwing everything I could at it. But once I started to understand procedure rules, and how things should be done and everything else, it was very apparent that what the council were doing was not that. And so I started to look into, well, where would the loopholes or the obvious things that I can start pressing come into play? And I started just focusing on the summons itself and the liability order. And I just wanted to pick that apart. And that's really kind of what we're doing now. And obviously over time, I've been able to implement other things. You've got the obligation argument that stands on the Bill of Rights, etc., etc. So there's a lot of different things you can bring into that argument now, but I like to keep it very simple. And my whole kind of ethos is, the path of least resistance. What I found with sovereignty as an example is that, it's like pushing water uphill, trying to get anywhere with that type of scenario. And even actually, to be honest with you, standing on things like the Bill of Rights, is another thing for me where it's like pushing water uphill. I'd rather get a win.
Yes.
And I'm not looking for a win necessarily where I've got my big day in court, and you've got your proud moment there, because to be frank, that's a very difficult thing to do. The way I approach it now, and this is how I approach everything, debt claims and all of the stuff now, is I like to go after the individual, because often it's the individual that's actually ignorant as to what it is they're doing themselves.
Yes.
And when you can outline the facts as to what should be happening, that isn't happening, and their personal liability in that situation, I found that where we put that pressure on them, they can often stop.
Right.
So it's not that you're going to get this shiny certificate that you can mount on your wall saying, well done, you've beaten the council, whatever it's going to be, but how do we know that it's stopped? And I can just use my own example. I have not received a bill for a couple of years. They stopped, and they've gone quiet. Now, I'm not saying one won't rock up and I've got to deal with it again, but from my point of view, that's happened, and that's really the objective we have with everyone that we help hands-on. It's just putting pressure on the individual so they just have that kind of moment where they consider their own actions. And I'm not saying that everyone in these councils are bad. I refuse to believe that. I believe they have a conscience, and a lot of the time it's just about education. And for what we're doing, that's proving to be working. So we'll continue doing the same thing. So I guess my ethos is really more about, the system exists. The system, in my view, is absolutely corrupted. I think we can all agree that the system itself was set up with that in mind. It wasn't set up for the people in the first place. And, we can talk about the straw man and all these other good things. I mean, that for me is a simple fact. If that exists, how can we be saying that this whole system has some legitimacy and that the rule of law still exists within that system? I question that logic, because if the system's foundation is corrupt, why are we trying to bring back a rule of law within the very corrupt system that's trying to kill us? Let's be honest about it. So I look at it like the system provides tools that we can use to exploit the loopholes and therefore go after these individuals in their personal capacity, whether that brings them to a stop because they realise what they're doing is wrong, or whether we can bring a claim against them, whatever way it works. That for me is ultimately how we deal with it. The sovereignty side of it for me is that I take the view that I'm already sovereign. So why do I need to write to anybody in this system to prove it?
Very good.
It validates the system. So why waste your time doing all of that? I don't need some person to respond and say, well done, you're sovereign now, you go live your sovereign life. It's like,
still pay the council tax.
Yeah, just live as a sovereign. To keep it simple.
Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed that you did in the one that Darren put up was you're talking about the council tax, and we assume, stupidly I suppose, that, and you've already said it's a corrupt system, but we assume that because it's legislation and the government have made it, that the councils are duty bound to go through the rules correctly, and that they ought to know it because they've been doing it for donkey's years. And that we, ignorant people that we are as householders and whatever, should just rely on them to be doing it properly, because in theory, why wouldn't they? But actually, watching the video that you've done with Darren, and on your site as well, which we'll list below, is the fact that they take these corrupt shortcuts, I suppose, like hiring a room in a court, and the judge isn't over on oath, and they're sort of rubber stamping people who are behind, as I understand it, and then just sending out the demands for money. And what should go on is that each and every case should be under oath, and actually the people who are being, they ought to have the right to come to court to make their case, and that's not happening. And so, by the way that they're acting, they're illegal in the first place. Is that, have I summed that up pretty accurately?
Yeah, I mean, if we look, these are, the magistrates' court is what's classed as an administrative court. The county courts are administrative courts, and I don't want to get too far into that, but they are all provably unlawful in the way that they operate. And there's a lot of case precedent in history that confirms that, and even Aylesbury Laws of Parliament say the same thing. So we're dealing with that illegitimacy, that we're going into that knowingly, right? Yeah. So if we focus then on the magistrates' court, you've got a civil matter being heard in the magistrates' court, and obviously there are court rules to confirm that can be done. But they're doing that because they can get away with the shortcutting of everything to do it. They are in cahoots with the council. If you've been to these hearings enough times, and we have quite a lot of people. I mean, it's how many coincidences before it's mathematically impossible that is exactly what is going on, and the things that we've seen and they've done, it's just unbelievable. Yeah. So when you look at that, and then just to simplify the whole thing, there is case law that confirms this too. That even just the issuance of a summons cannot be a purely administrative function. That a magistrate or an agent of the court must apply their minds to the matter at hand to determine whether a summons should be issued. Now, by impossibility, that cannot happen with the council tax because they bulk list everything.
Right.
So there is no way that there's a magistrate in those courts every week going through thousands of these complaints determining whether a summons should be issued. And the proof of that is the fact that everybody in those complaint lists gets a summons.
Yes.
The other problem is the council are issuing the summons.
Which they're not supposed to do.
Well, they're not supposed to, and there's a lot of case law again to confirm how these summonses should be issued, but they have tweaked the legislation to basically confirm that they can do that. But the weak link in all of that, and we've done this with the MOJ now, the Ministry of Justice, is that there is no authority that exists. The authority to confirm that the judiciary can give a council the powers of a judiciary does not exist.
Right.
Yet they're doing it.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, now the simple fact is that they're doing that. They are in breach of an older piece of legislation called the Local Government Act, 1888, and it's Section 78. Now, I'm just summing this up simply, but the council or any employee of the council cannot impersonate the judiciary. That's exactly what's going on. They cannot not impersonate, act as the judiciary.
So when you get that piece of paper that says summons and it's actually not on court paper or come from the court, it's come from your local council, it isn't an actual, real, genuine summons.
Correct. So that's the point to start challenging, not the council, not the fiction, the individual that is standing behind that. So anybody that's done any type of noticing or letters to the council know that eventually you're going to get that head of council tax kind of putting their name to it and coming back saying, basically cut and paste, Local Government Finance Act, you've got no choice, So the way I've got past, or we get past that, is we start challenging these facts, and you can then use the physical evidence that you have served me what you're calling a summons. I've got some questions about said summons. And then you're putting that individual in a corner because they need to answer the questions now. But the other part of that is you've got evidence that you've asked the questions. So if they continue, as they often like to do, so that the actual hearing, they're now committing offences.
Right, yes. Because it's that, am I right in thinking it's that business about the court itself is the council is a corporation, which is a legal fiction.
Correct.
So it works on paper, but they can't do anything on their own because it's just a building and an idea more than anything else. So you need people, real people, to actually do the stuff. And so you targeting that person who's an employee, but he is a real person.
And they're liable.
And then they become, and they may not know that.
Exactly.
And so then that must put the wind up when you're starting to sort of go, well, we'll take you to court, that's fine. But if it goes the wrong way, mate, you're the one that's paying the court fees and all the other things.
And that's it. So when you notice them, when you do it, however you do it, I like to start off with the facts in a nice way. I don't kind of go in aggressively and say, you crooks, and this is what you're doing. I just put it as, look, I've got some questions. I'm slightly confused. I'm in receipt of this summons. This is my understanding of how a summons ought to be served. And then I ask the questions, knowing that I've got the case law and everything to come back with. So if you know the truth, you can set them up to bring them in and trap them, because they love to keep making claims they can't really substantiate.
Right.
And the only thing they can ever really hide behind is the Local Government Finance Act. So by default, that's where they go. And then you can bring them in further. So as an example, if they carry on with the hearing, that individual now, especially if they're the head of council tax, is meant to be at the hearing. So could they be liable for perjury? And now I know they're a fake court and everything else, but the offences are real.
Yes.
So you just want to outline the facts and have them understanding that initially they might think, oh, this is some guy just getting some stuff off the internet and sending it through. When they carry on, we then have case law as pertains to the liability order itself. Now, we know that the actual legal form was discontinued in 2003. There is no ability for a court to issue a liability order. Yet there is case law that exists that confirms that a physical copy of that order has to be evidenced, or some way of proving that there is an order. So when you know these facts, you can start, as you can imagine, you can start asking simple questions that they can't really answer.
And you're empowered by that because you know the facts beforehand. It's not like you're just willy-nilly asking. I mean, it's kind of like a game of chess, really, except that you have all the pieces on your side.
Well, that's really it. You're just leading them in. So, you know, I don't have the data and the facts because we never really track this stuff, but the summons part has been very successful in preventing the hearings going forward. And so let's just kind of look at that. Have you had an absolute win and stopped the council? No, but if they can't get a liability order against you, there's no way of enforcing anything.
And just explain for people who don't know what a liability order is, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, it's meant to be that, you know, you've been summoned legitimately. You've gone to court, they've heard the matter as pertains to the claim, they've looked through all of the facts and they can establish that there is a debt owed and that we are liable, and therefore they then issue the liability order.
Right.
But none of that's happening. And in fact, even in the complaint, we've got, I even go through, by the way, guys, I can provide this to you, Richard, in a downloadable document, but we even point out what the actual complaint should include for the summons to be considered by a magistrate. And the fact is, if you push the council, they'll provide you that complaint, and they just redact all of the names and give your name, and it's just your name, address, and the amount. Well, that doesn't confirm anything.
No.
It certainly doesn't provide the evidence necessary to determine that there's a summons required, because there's a real debt here. Yeah, the other thing that sorry, Richard, go on.
No, I was just going to say, well, you know who you are. You know who you are. You need the rest of the evidence.
Exactly. I mean, if you can't bring a claim and just say Richard is liable for 10,000, there you go, and then a magistrate goes, oh yeah, right. Well, there's the summons. We'll go. Let's get the hearing. You know, it's an absolute joke, but it's going on every day. The other thing is that the MOJ have they issued not recently, but they've issued confirmation as to how pre-action protocol for debt claims ought to be conducted, and local authorities are not exempt from that. And when they like to cite the Local Government Act and the associated regulations, when you go into the regulations, they confirm that those liable are classed as debtors. The word debtor is used a lot. Yes. Well, you can't use that word and then ignore pre-action protocol for debt claims. You can't have it both ways. And there's nothing in the Local Government Finance Act that says that they're exempt from following pre-action protocol for debt claims. So there's another way you can push them. Now, obviously, in that, pre-action protocol for debt claims means there has to be some form of agreement. We know that legislation is not law. We know that legislation requires our compliance, our consent. These are the things that they don't like to admit, and they're the things they say, well, there's no contracts required. But again, you can't have it both ways.
No, exactly.
You know, if there are protocols and rules in the system that determine that there has to be X, Y, Z evidence, and you're not doing it, then you're clearly breaching something somewhere. So it's just knowing those things and putting them on the lap of the individual that is saying, hey, you're liable, pay up.
Yes.
And then say, well, explain this then.
And now, I mean, an ordinary person coming along thinking, blimey, you know, I feel now empowered to do all of this. It's not, I mean, it's not an easy task unless you've done it before, presumably, or you've got the help of somebody else like yourself. And I'm guessing you're not saying, you know, do this yourself. You know, you might not be recommending your own help, of course, because, you know, other places are available, sort of thing.
Absolutely.
But would you say that it's not something, unless you're very quite well versed in all these acts and rules that have been made, it's a bit foolhardy because they can bullshit baffles brains at the end of the day, isn't it? They can, the full force of them, and they can scare you with their big black print and their big, you know, it's a summons, and you go, oh my God, hang on, what have I got myself into? And presumably some people do try and then they bottle it because it seems too much.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a few things to unpick there. So just in terms of how we work with people, you know, people watch the videos and they book a call and we have a bit of a chit chat, and there's kind of two ways we take it. And again, it depends on the individual. Some people are literally, I've just realised what's going on, like what do I do, where do I start? And some of those want hands-on help. Others are just, you know, point me in the right direction. What do I need to read and etc. So when we help people like that, it's more a case of us saying, right, well, read these books, start reading this legislation. And the way we do that is we have calls as and when they need it, where they go, right, I know this now, I've just done that, what do you think about this? And one of the things I sort of say to people is that it's certainly in the first year of, honourably not paying the council tax. We're not willfully not paying, we're honourably not paying. That's a big difference. You've got a runway of a year, really, to learn what you need to learn. Because let's look at the scenario here. If you're doing things that aren't working or they're ignoring you, all they're going to do is get to the summons, get to the liability order, and then get the enforcement agents instructed. And their whole gambit at that point is they can wash their hands of you, and then they're working on the assumption that the enforcement agents do what they need to do, you get scared sufficiently and pay up. Job's done. But the thing is, if you know that the enforcement agents have no power, then that threat doesn't really matter, which means you've got really a year worth of trial and error and doing things, learning and trying things out. It doesn't matter. Nothing's going to happen to you. You're not going to prison or any of those things that they talk about. So where people have got that kind of confidence to just give it a go, that's what we like to support, because I think that's the better way to do it. It's really empowering when you do these things. I had a lady recently, actually just spoke to her again this morning. She'd just recently woken up, and we started with the paper, just to kind of prove a point to her, just to show that these things can work. Let's get the hearing adjourned. So she actually went down to the court herself, and she started. I'll do that to say you need to see it and experience it to realise exactly what's really going on. And she went down there. They pointed her back to the council because obviously there's nothing listed in the courts. Went to the council and they said, well, we've never ever had anybody make this inquiry before.
Oh, really?
And this was all really empowering for her because she knew that she was on the right path. And long story short, they adjourned the hearing. Side note on that, you tell me where a claimant has the power and authority to adjourn a hearing when they're making the claim against you. That in itself is so wrong, but that's what's going on. But that empowered her, so she's continuing on her journey, so she's got the confidence. The other side of that is where maybe they don't necessarily have the confidence or they need a little bit more support. We kind of call it doing it with you.
Yes.
So we're not taking on cases per se like a solicitor would. We're doing it with them, but we can get sort of one-on-one. So that might be that we're drafting notices and rebuttals or whatever it may be. We'll be setting the strategy based on what it is the council is and isn't doing. But we can use their case and what we're doing as a way to fast-track the learning. So it's then not a case of, right, go and read that big book, come back with or read this legislation that doesn't make any sense.
I did buy one of the books that you recommend. And
it's a read, isn't it?
I'm not very, where's the thing? I'm not very far through at the moment. But it does empower you. I mean, if you can understand the blooming terminology, that's half the thing. But if you've got somebody like yourself that you can say, look, I've got this, I don't really understand this part of this law or whatever, then it's very helpful.
And that's why we do it. I mean, we didn't set out with the intention to do that, but it was just a case of more and more people saying, look, can you just help us? We just thought, well, let's see how that would work and do it. And to be honest with you, we're doing a lot of that now. Which is great because I just take the simple view that forget all of the legislation and the loopholes. The more that just simply stand and honourably say no more, the sooner this whole thing ends anyway.
Yes, no, absolutely, and so it is a numbers thing that the more
absolutely
people are getting on top of it and saying, look, this is a nonsense, and of course, more and more people, I think, are beginning to think, hang on, the government and the councils, what with the 15-minute cities and things, that are doing stuff that we've not asked for, so why are we paying for it?
Exactly.
Because if the councillors were doing their job properly and holding much more notified meetings so that people could come in and have their say and say, well, do you want this? It's an idea. And people go, no, not bloody likely, thanks very much. They say, okay, we won't do it then. If that was happening, you'd think, okay, there's some value into paying this tax. But if they're just pushing stuff down your throat, it's like, well, actually, not only do I not want to have this, but I don't want to pay for it either.
Exactly that.
And
I think we're all aware of the real agenda that's going on. So,
yes.
We understand what's really at play. So for me, it's just a case of, I always say to people, look, it's not necessarily that you're in this for the win. And if you're certainly doing it because you just, it's got it too expensive, I always say, don't start. Because you will give up. You won't see this through. If you're going to make a stand for truth and sovereignty and what is right, then you've got to be prepared to sort of take the black eyes and the thick lips along the way, and often you have to have a very big why as to why you're making the stand.
Yes.
And it's not then just about council tax. It starts to dovetail into everything that this system is up to
Yes.
and trying to do to us, you know.
You mentioned the thugs that come round to try and get the money from you, the enforcement agencies, and you said that they don't actually have any power. Now, I suppose a lot of people will think, hang on a minute, but they, you see the images or you read the story about someone taking their car away, or they coming in and breaking into the house to take stuff. Now, I know I had some time ago when my kids were small, they're in their 30s now, but we had CCJs against us, counter court judgments. And we did have bailiffs coming. And on one occasion, we didn't have any money at all. I was in the entertainment industry, didn't have any money. And my wife, who was at home at the time, said, we did see this bloke, and he peered through the window. He saw there was absolutely nothing to take. He didn't bother to knock on the door. And I said, oh, I know I was away at the time. But we had that threat. But you get the feeling, because of the threats and menaces and all that paperwork that comes through, that they somehow, for some reason, and you don't quite understand it because it's fear, that they do have the ability to take your stuff. So when you say they don't have any power, could you just explain how that works?
Yeah, it's actually quite simple. And this is specific to council tax, so I can bring this into other situations where these goons might get involved. But if we look at council tax specifically, we know that they can't evidence a physical liability order. So the simple fact is this: if we have, the council is a corporation, right? They're instructing another corporation, a company, a limited company often, to go and enforce this alleged debt. But this just simply comes down to assignment of the debt or a contract. So in simple terms, if there's a contract, it has to express third-party contract rights, i.e. there has to be a contract between us and the council, and those enforcement agents are written into the contract, which means that they then have a right to enforce that debt.
Right.
That doesn't exist. The other way it can happen then is with assignment of the debt. Okay? But there has to be a paper trail of that assignment. There has to be what's called a notice of assignment, which clearly isn't happening. And that has to be proved to be served. And there has to be, we have a right to see a deed of assignment. Okay? Now, these are actually the things we use with debt collectors for credit card debts and those kind of things, but it's still applicable to these guys. So what is it they're saying? So they ignore that stuff and they say, well, no, Local Government Finance Act, blah, 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 there's a liability order. Okay, well, where is it then?
Yeah.
Well, we don't have that, but that's not the point. So you can call them out very easily. And what they tend to then do is they escalate the fear tactics. So, we can get a warrant of control to take your goods. And they'll cite, I think it's Schedule 12 of the Court and Tribunals Act. And what they're basically doing is they're citing the correct legislation, as pertains to the service of one of those warrants. But what they like to or conveniently miss out is how a warrant like that is obtained. And what they generally say is that, and they actually say the Traffic Enforcement Centre, I've seen this coming up so many times when they're challenged, what the hell has a Traffic Enforcement Centre got to do with issuing a bloody warrant of control of goods? There's a question. But they say that they've done that, and they gave authority to the council to provide the warrant. And then they provide you this warrant, which is a document, big red writing all over it. It's just completely fake. And when you challenge them on that and say that, thank you for the evidence of your offence, fraud by misrepresentation, you can easily call this stuff out. So the simple fact is, because there is no order that can be evidenced, because there's no assignment of the debt, there's no contract, there is no warrant, they have no power.
Right.
So the simplest way then to deal with them, and I think Sovereign Pete mentioned something like this about contract. This system of commerce is all about contract. So the first thing they will ask you, as the police do as well, is, what is your name? Are you XYZ?
Yeah.
Don't answer. There's no obligation to provide any answer to that. So if you don't confirm that, they don't know who you are. How can they do anything?
Yeah, how can they do anything?
So that's what people say, I want to go fight them, I want to bring claims. It's like, you just save your energy, put it into something else worthwhile fighting. Okay, you might have to put up with a few knocks on the door here and there, but eventually they're going to give up. And essentially they give up because they're paid upon their ability to extract or extort cash from people. If they know they're not being paid by you, They obviously know they're not, they're a bit dim, these people, but they're not that stupid to know they're not getting paid, so there's no point keep knocking on the door.
No, absolutely. At the end of the day, it is a business. I had a... No, go on.
No, please, carry on.
Well, I was going to talk. I just wanted to highlight something that happened to me with a parking ticket, because obviously people get one of these private parking ticket firms who chased me for about something like 10 years. This thing just kept going on and on and on, and the debt collecting company, because I knew I was in the right, because they'd put a ticket that said it was 2 minutes between me parking and then the ticket issued, and I just thought, that's just unreasonable. How can I go and get a permit or a ticket to put on the car within 2 minutes? And so I knew that it was invalid all the way through, so I didn't pay it. And I had these debt collectors eventually coming in and saying, you owe us this, all this. And then it would change, and then it would be another debt collector came in, and, still with the big black letters, and then eventually it went to court, and it was a long old thing. As I say, it took about like 10 years, this thing. And I knew that I wanted to have the day in court, because I just thought, I really don't have a thing to answer because it's 2 minutes. If it had been longer, I may have been a bit more nervous, but I was fairly confident. And the thing I wanted to mention was that when I turned up at the court, one of the debt collector agencies had somebody to speak on their behalf. They took me aside and said, you're not going to win, so do you want to settle out of court? And if you do, it'll be 200 quid, because you'll probably spend 300 or 400 quid, that's what it will be, and you'll plus the court charges and all that. And even at the last minute, they were putting on the threat. And I said, no, I've come this far. After 10 years, I'm going to have my day in court, thanks very much. And as it happened, the magistrate said, no, this is unreasonable. 2 minutes to go and put, no load of... And so, it was great to see this person who tried to extract money from me, their face drop as they lost the case, and had to cough up after 10 years. So that was a nice win all the way through. But it's interesting how right to the end they're desperate for their money.
They will definitely do that. I don't know if your audience knows, or even yourself, Richard, but PCNs, just a very simple way to deal with them. If they're council issued PCNs, they're illegal. They breach the Bill of Rights. There's a section of the Bill of Rights that simply states that all grants and fines of forfeitures before conviction are illegal and void.
Wow.
That one section voids council PCNs. When they're private, like you had, what they generally do is they go on to contract. So what I like to do is start off with the Bill of Rights, for them to say, oh no, that's not relevant, it's a contract matter. Oh, thank you very much. So what you then do is you cite the 5 certainties of contract, of which we can literally give case law for every single point. They come back and say, well, these terms and conditions up here are enough proof of a contract. But you cannot meet the 5 certainties of contract just by saying there's a terms and conditions sign and you should have read it.
Yes.
So when you challenge like that, they're actually quite straightforward to just get them dismissed, because they don't want the hassle. When you've done that, of then taking you to court, it's like, this is probably a £60 thing. It's going to cost us way more to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually on that point, just another little tip, guys. We are in a system of commerce. So if you decide to kind of use the tools the system present to fight it with these different things, understand that it costs them to come after you. So one tactic actually is just make it cost more.
Yeah. So it becomes it's not in their interest.
It's commercially unviable to keep chasing you. So that you can win in so many different ways. It doesn't have to be your big day in court, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yes. No, I mean, I didn't particularly initially want to go to court, but then it had something called a mediation they wanted to do with me.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what is there to mediate? It's like 2 minutes, and I still don't see that you're going to convince me otherwise. And then in the end, the court said, no, there's no point to the mediation. We'll just have and I said, I'm happy. I want it now. But I wasn't looking to do that. It was just one of those things. When you said with the council tax, and you said, you've got a year. The other question I wanted to ask is, very often some people will probably think, oh, I've missed a payment, and I do want to fight this. If I make a mistake, are they going to come down on me like a ton of bricks tomorrow? Because we always think, the way that I say we always think, but it's probably just me. You feel like they're just waiting at the corner so that, you know, with threats and menaces, that you've made this mistake and suddenly, right, okay, we're going to take everything else if you don't pay right this second, which again is part of the fear factor.
It is, and I think, and that's a really good point. And kind of bringing it back to the point I was saying earlier on, like you're already sovereign. We're already sovereign. So one of the things of really comprehending who we are is understanding that why should we care what they do or don't do? Why should we pay any attention to them saying, you know, you can only do these 3 things, or you've got X amount of time to do this, or you've got to do that, and like, who cares? Right. So what is it they can actually do? They can still only do the same things that they do to everyone else anyway, which is get a summons, get the hearing, get the liability order, get the enforcement agents involved. Right. So if they're your 3 points, that's all they can do anyway.
Yes.
And then we do have actually people saying, oh, you know, what about the prison thing? You know, you can go to prison. I know people have done that. Again, it's just fear tactics. People that go to prison are basically voluntarily putting themselves there for these things. The regulation, I can give you some stories on this, like the regulation, again, it's not legislation, it's one below, it's regulation, states willful refusal.
Right.
We're not willfully refusing anything. We're honourably asking some questions before we commit to paying. Yes. And it's the questions we're asking that cause the problems, because we know they're right. We know what the answers are. The other part of that is that, you know, how, and I can actually say this happened. I'll give you a real story. Dealing with a guy, now he'd been doing this for years, so the council really knew who he were. They really wanted to get him. And, you know, they issued this warrant for his arrest. You will never get a police officer standing on that warrant knocking on your door for your arrest, because it's illegitimate. That's the truth. So who does the arrest? The enforcement agents. And they generally come in plain clothes. They look very official, but they're enforcement agents. They're making a citizen's arrest like everyone else can do. And this is what I mean by voluntarily just giving yourself up.
Oh, I see, yes.
So I actually had this where they knocked on the door and the guy phoned me while it was actually happening, and I just fortunately just picked it up. And long story short, he called the police to ask if the warrant was legitimate. And obviously they said, we don't have any warrants here. Like, you know, don't know what you're talking about. As soon as obviously it's on loudspeaker, the bailiffs, the enforcement agents made their excuse and left.
Yeah, I bet they did.
So it's a case of just knowing what's really going on, and then just standing your ground, standing in your own sovereignty, and understanding there's a line between you living in the private and sovereign, and then you crossing over into their system.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you said an interesting point then, which I learnt from having to go to when I was with the kids, and they were very small, and they were threatening county court judgments at the time. And I remember going into the council to say, please don't do this. And they said, well, I'm sorry, we're going to do it. And so I got down on my bended knees and begged them in front of everybody else. You know, I was an actor, so it was fine. And the kids were with me, saying, please don't do this, we'll be destitute, blah, blah, blah. And you know, put them in an embarrassing situation. But they said, well, you know, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. And it's like, oh, okay, fair enough. But the thing that I learnt was, as long as you say, I'm willing to pay, but I, you know, can't, but as you just so rightly said, but I've got questions, you're being honourable, aren't you? Because you're
Absolutely.
saying, okay, I'll pay this, but can you just answer these questions, because I think it's, you know, fair that you do, rather than, as you just say, close the door, go, I'm not willing, but I don't have anything to do with this. Because if you don't offer to pay or push back, then that whole thing of being honourable in law and in sovereignty is working against you.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And that's where they do really run you over, because you've done nothing to rebut anything that they're doing. Yeah. And this is my point where we started this video. It's that, you know, the sovereignty stuff is all well and good, but you cannot ignore the system.
Yes.
And those that do generally get into a lot of trouble. And we help a few of those people where they've maybe been listening to other groups out there, and you know, they get into a bit of bother, and then we sort of step in to try and help unpick everything, using the system to do it.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. So people should give, well, I mean, they may want to fight it or they may want to push back, but if at least they're saying, look, we're willing to engage with you, but just, you know, before we, like with anything, we just like some proof, because
exactly,
and that's exactly. And they can't argue against that, surely, and say, well, we just like some proof, because it's so sensible. For one thing, it's like, you know, it's
Well, you'd like to think.
Well,
that,
you'd
but
like to
again,
think-
there's so many different things they come up with as to why they won't reply and all these different things. And I mean, it's actually on that point. One of the things that we say to a lot of folks now is just do nothing in certain situations. Again, I'm not saying every situation,
No.
and I'm not saying specifically council tax, but there's a lot of things going on that people are dealing with. And there was a time when we do the RTS thing, return to sender, and all of these different things. But the reality now is that, how do I put this? I know we're on YouTube as well, so people have had the spears, as it were, in the arms, and
Yes.
there are unfortunately rapidly rising excess deaths, etc. And a lot of the people in the public sector in these companies have had the spears, and they're unfortunately passing. And these companies are hemorrhaging staff left, right, and centre, because don't forget, there are staff in these companies that are aware of things as well. So where you've got this rising tidal wave of people standing saying no more, and you've got the other side of that where there's the people in the system sort of overseeing what's going on, there's actually very, very high probability now that just being quiet means you just disappear under the radar, because a lot of these letters are automated, right? And it's often the people that are RTSing and doing different things are almost like the red rag to the bull. Well, I'm still here, come and get me. Whereas if you don't reply, there's no one's no bum on a seat looking into your matter, because it costs them money to do so.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
actually, we're in a position right now where, and I've done this actually with I like to play and test things out in different ways, and I've just done this with a utility provider where I previously just agreed a £10 a month payment on contract law sort of basis, and they've switched me to a different company. I've just literally ignored them, and I've done that for the last 18 months, and nothing's happened.
And nothing's happened.
And then you hear all these other different horror stories.
Yes.
And I know that's happened simply because they don't know whether I'm here or not.
Yes, and I suppose when you switch and then you start to do something, you've agreed, you've acquiesced, and and so the jurisdiction, they've got you. Whereas if you don't agree to, because you didn't agree to have another company deal with it.
Exactly, it comes down to contract again. If I need to fight it, I can. But the point I'm making is that we're at a point where I think that you should consider whether you even want to do the fight, because that takes energy.
Yes.
And that's going to take time, whether you're learning what you've got to do. When actually, if you just think, I don't do anything, let's see what happens.
Right.
And you might, you can get away with that for months and months and months, and why not?
Well, exactly. So can I ask you a question then, to round off this? Because we've got these things with what people are sort of nervous about now, with the 15-minute cities and the 20-minute low traffic and all of this, and the biometrics and being fined, and infringements that will be coming in. Presumably this is a similar sort of system, really. It's the same laws that are in action, that you've been captured driving your car 101 times from one end of the city to the other end of the city, or wherever it is. And the only way they can really convince you not to do this in the future, to save the planet or whatever it is to fine you. So it still comes back, does it not, to the same principle that actually if you don't engage with it, or you work out the system that works for you, eventually they just will have to give up issuing fines if nobody's... I mean, they did one in Birmingham, didn't they, if I remember rightly? They had to write off something like £70,000.
Failed, yeah.
Because people just didn't bother to pay it. And you think,
yeah,
well, that's the way forward, surely.
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, the simplest remedy for all of us now is just mass non-compliance.
Yes.
They can't do it. I think we are very close to the end game. And there's obviously there's two camps, I would guess. It's all going to be bad and it's just terrible. We've got no hope. And there's the other side that there's good things coming. And I stand on the side that there's good things coming, because we can prove it. I mean, there's so many things now we can point to show that that's happening.
Yeah.
So I just think it's more about mass non-compliance. The other thing, and I know a lot of your guests have talked about this very eloquently, is constitution. I think there's got to be, there's lots of different opinions as to what is the Constitution. Are we standing on the Bill of Rights? Is it the Magna Carta? All these different types of conversations. I think that it's got to be simplified in so much as that I think everybody, if they comprehend trial by jury and what that type of law system, if you like, means for us, that we can repeal legislation, the people can do that. Bringing that back, I think, is the thing that we need to do.
Yeah.
Now, there are different opinions on constitution, but I think that the masses need to be having the conversation. A lot of people I ask about constitution don't even know that we've got anything like that, don't even really comprehend the meaning of the word. And I think that's really where we want to be focusing. So even though, I'm saying use the system and everything else, I don't think that isn't going to be the way we win anything. That's just a way to just kind of stand in your power and firefight the day-to-days. But the real thing for me is, well, where is the Constitution? How at some point when the SHIT hits the fan, what are we actually standing on?
Yes.
And I for me personally, use the Bill of Rights, comprehend all of that, everything's great, but that cannot be constitutional. It's a statute. Who gave anyone authority to do that?
Yeah,
It's part of the very system that is against us. So I think we've got to come to a point now where we need mass non-compliance and we need a conversation about constitution.
Yes.
What is it? Where is it? What are we actually standing on? And then how do we move forward together?
Yeah, and I think you're right with the trial by jury. I mean, we have jury trials, which is not the same thing by any means.
Complete joke, yeah.
And you're absolutely right, because if you've got the people who can try those rules for us and say, actually, this rule is really just about making money for a government, and it's not really helping anybody. You're 2 minutes late from parking, and it's just not. Or you've driven accidentally on a yellow line. No harm's been done whatsoever. It's a stupid rule. You've been captured by a camera, and you've just got to pay 65 quid for just hitting the curb. So, okay, you might be done for driving dangerously, and if you were driving dangerously, but at least the jury can look at the evidence and say, yeah, no, you were driving dangerously, so you should pay the fine, or you weren't driving or actually that rule is just so stupid. Let's not get rid.